Hello, and welcome to a very special top 10 list because with it being Godzilla's overall 70th anniversary, what better way to celebrate 7 decades of the Godzilla franchise than by counting down what I consider to be the top 10 most iconic moments of the Godzilla franchise. With my only caveat being that I'm only going to talk about one moment per movie. And just remember, my picks are not the correct picks, but they are picks that I feel are important to the franchise in some shape or form. And with that said, onwards with the list. Coming in at number 10, the atomic breath scene from Shin Godzilla. No matter how you feel about this movie, regardless if you love it or hate it, there's no denying that this will go down as being one of the most iconic atomic breath sequences in the entire franchise, because we've seen Godzilla use his atomic breath in many movies before and after this. And why I think this atomic breath sequence will stand out from many other atomic breath sequences is a combination of both the unpredictability of Godzilla during the sequence and the escalation of the destruction he causes throughout this scene as well. Because when you first see him about to use the atomic breath, you have no idea what he's doing at first, because you see him leaning forward, aiming at the ground first, and then you see him spit out some kind of black smog that goes in every which direction. Then a few seconds later, you see him ignite said smog, which turns into fire, engulfing the city in flames. And if that wasn't enough, we see that fire breath of his slowly transform into this atomic breath, and we see him use it for a few seconds, slicing some buildings. And then next thing you know, you see him close his mouth and shoot said atomic breath from his dorsal fins, destroying all of the US bombers that were hurting him a few minutes ago, continuously destroying more buildings in the process. It's just a really insane sequence altogether, because not only does it have a ton of spectacle, but it's also a really haunting scene at the same time in regards to how we see Godzilla use his atomic breath during this sequence. Not only that, but this is also the one point in time within the context of the movie where we have any sort of idea of what Godzilla is feeling through the song playing in the background called Who Will Know, which, from how I understood the song, in terms of how it's meant to represent Godzilla's feelings at that moment, roughly translates to being, I am both depressed and in pain, and no one is going to understand that. Also, having the detail of having Godzilla's atomic breath in this sequence start out as fire at first, to me, has to be an intentional callback to a lot of these Americanized Godzilla posters from back in the day, where Godzilla would be depicted being green in color while spitting fire. And this version of Godzilla, while in his fourth form, is not only more greenish in color, but again, he also has an atomic breath that starts out as fire. Not only that, but I feel that this is going to set a new standard for atomic breath scenes moving forward for the Godzilla franchise. Don't believe me, look no further than Godzilla -1 with its atomic breath scene, whereas I feel that was heavily influenced by this here. And while that atomic breath scene was very good, I don't think any atomic breath scene will be as iconic as the one from Shin Godzilla, because of how unpredictable and destructive the entire sequence was altogether. Coming in at number 9, Godzilla vs. Zilla from Godzilla Final Wars. No matter what you think of the movie, regardless if you're someone who either loves the movie or hates the movie, most fans can universally agree that one of the major highlights of that movie is seeing the Japanese Godzilla fight against the, at the time, first Americanized incarnation of Godzilla, now renamed Zilla for this particular movie, or at least a creature called Zilla that so happens to be based on the 1998 Roland Emmerich Godzilla. Yeah, there's a whole name change controversy surrounding this particular creature, which I'm not going to go into, but anywho. Honestly, I don't think I need to go into too much detail in terms of why I think this is an iconic moment from the franchise itself, so I'll keep it as brief as I can. Because within the context of the Godzilla franchise up to this point, this was the second Godzilla movie to poke fun at the 1998 Roland Emmerich movie, but this scene was just on a whole nother level, because nobody was expecting it. You quite literally have the American Godzilla battling the Japanese Godzilla, in what is essentially a throwaway fight, given that Toho was really leaning into that whole hate train surrounding the 1998 Roland Emmerich movie, resulted in the creation of this particular moment. You also have the fact that both creatures are depicted using the methods that depicted them, with the Japanese Godzilla being depicted as a man-in-suit creation, whereas the American Godzilla is depicted as this intentionally bad CGI model. And to top it all off, you also have We're All to Blame by Sum 41 playing in the background of this fight, which to me was really bizarre, but in a way, fitting. Not only that, but it was also fitting that we also got to see this fight in this particular Godzilla movie, because really, if it wasn't for the 1998 Roland Emmerich Godzilla movie, we wouldn't have gotten the Millennium series. So, in a way, we kind of bookend the Millennium era of Godzilla by including the design of Roland Emmerich's Godzilla into Godzilla Final Wars, which since then has become its own character called Zilla, which has, in recent years, developed a fan base, to such a point that a lot of fans actually want to see Zilla back in a mainstream Godzilla movie. Not only that, but this sequence also introduced a lot of Godzilla fans to the band Sum 41 as a result. Coming in at number 8, an alliance is formed, the Monsterverse edition, from Godzilla X Kong, the New Empire. And to some people, this might be a general surprise, but hear me out. Why I decided to include this on the list. If there's any shot that best represents 70 years of the entire Godzilla franchise, this would be it. For the simple reason that you have 3 of cinema's most iconic giant monsters all in one shot, consisting of Godzilla, Kong, and Mothra. And to add on top of that, this is not only the 3rd time Godzilla and Kong have been in a movie together, but this is the very first time Kong and Mothra have appeared in a movie together at the same time. And I really do think that's very fitting for this moment, considering that without Kong and Mothra, Godzilla would not be what he is today. Hell, if it wasn't for Kong and Mothra, I don't think I would even be making this list at all if it wasn't for those two, because they both have a huge impact on the franchise, where you have Kong, who not only inspired Godzilla, but also introduced the entire world to Godzilla, but you also have Mothra, who I think did a much more important job of sustaining Godzilla and becoming the household name he is today. Since the original Mothra movie, from my understanding, at the time of its release made more money than the first 2 Godzilla movies put together, and with the original King Kong vs. Godzilla movie being such a box office hit, Toho decided to recapture the magic again, but instead of using Kong, they decided to use Mothra, and the rest is history, at least from how I understand it. And to add on top of that, the entire scene takes place in Egypt, which is a very unique geographical location for this type of event. And I'm not sure if it's me, but I do like how there is a recurring motif between the 3 monsters featured within this one shot, in that sense where each monster represents a different element, with Mothra representing the air, Kong representing the earth, and with Godzilla representing not just water, but fire as well. But anywho, not only that, but this moment right here is clearly meant to pay homage to that one scene from Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. Although the context is different, given that both Mothra and Kong were trying to get Godzilla to help them fight Scar King Azarimi. And not only that, but this does showcase a couple different aspects about these incarnations of the characters, where Mothra does seem to be the one monster that Godzilla actually has respect for in this universe, to a point where she can get away with hitting Godzilla and not get killed as a result. And to go even further with their relationship, the moment you see Godzilla even look at Mothra, he actually seemed happy to see her, to a point where all the anger he had throughout the entire movie has disappeared, showcasing just how strong their symbiotic relationship is with each other. And at the same time, we see Kong, who has been established to not submit to anyone, actually acknowledge Godzilla being the king of the monsters in this instance, and there is not a single line of dialogue uttered throughout the entire scene. It's all just pure visual storytelling, which is what makes this scene a lot more impressive. Not only that, but since then, Godzilla's gained a new frenemy in the form of Kong, leading to a pretty epic kaiju bromance between Godzilla and Kong. And what better way to celebrate 70 years of the Godzilla franchise than by having three of cinema's most iconic monsters sharing one shot together. Coming in at number 7, Rodan's Sacrifice from Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. A movie that many consider to be one of the more average to sometimes one of the better installments of the franchise, depending on who you ask. But anywho, the reason why I consider this to be one of the more iconic moments from the Godzilla franchise has to do with Rodan's characterization here, in regards to one trait that he has on full display in this movie that sadly has not been seen since then, that being Rodan's loving nature, which we have not really seen since the original 1956 Rodan movie, because over the course of that movie, it's established that there's not one but two Rodans, and the characters establish that both of them are a mated pair. And during the film's climax, when the humans manage to activate a plan which revolves around them blowing up a volcano to take out both Rodans, they actually do manage to take out one of the Rodans, which results in one of them crashing into the volcano. And even though the other Rodan was nowhere near the eruption of the volcano, they choose to go into the volcano because they couldn't live without their mate and would rather die with their mate than live by themselves, showing just how much those two Rodans loved each other. Now, fast forward to Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 for the Heisei series, and not only does this movie manage to reintroduce Mechagodzilla for a new generation, but it also manages to reintroduce two other Godzilla kaiju in the form of both Rodan and Baby Godzilla. And Rodan, within the context of the movie, has some pretty strong characterization in regards to his relationship with Baby Godzilla, given that the two of them are stepbrothers, with Rodan clearly being the older stepbrother in this case. It is so protective of Baby Godzilla to a point that he's willing to fight both Godzilla and Mechagodzilla to protect Baby Godzilla. Now, fast forward to the last act of the movie, where we have Mechagodzilla fighting both Rodan and Godzilla back to back, and with both monsters seamlessly being crippled by Mechagodzilla, with Mechagodzilla on the verge of killing Godzilla. It seems as if G-Force, along with the rest of mankind, has finally won the battle against Godzilla after destroying his secondary brain, and while in the process of trying to kill Godzilla once and for all, Baby Godzilla senses that his father is now in danger and calls upon a now injured Rodan for help. And this moment right here really does showcase just how much Rodan loves Baby Godzilla. Rodan does something really unexpected, because earlier in the movie, a battle occurs between Rodan and Godzilla over custody of Baby Godzilla, which results in Rodan losing the battle. But then you fast forward to this moment in which we have Rodan now flying towards Godzilla's direction and proceeds to crash land onto him after being shot down by Mechagodzilla. Rodan does something really unexpected. He begins transferring his life force into Godzilla in order for Godzilla's secondary brain to repair itself. This results in not only Rodan dying in the process, but this also results in Godzilla being seamlessly resurrected, given a new power-up to finish off Mechagodzilla once and for all, ensuring that Rodan's sacrifice for his sake would not be in vain. And this scene right here speaks volumes in terms of how much Rodan really loves Baby Godzilla, to such a point that he was willing to give up his own life force to resurrect Godzilla, who he previously had a beef with earlier in the movie, to ensure that Baby Godzilla would be taken care of by another member of his family, even if they aren't members of the same species. But perhaps the most important takeaway from this entire scene is showcasing that Rodan and Godzilla are not monsters. They're characters that do have their own sense of personality and do have the ability to feel different emotions, with Rodan in this particular scene showcasing just how much he loves Baby Godzilla, resulting in one of the sadder moments of the entire Godzilla franchise. Coming in at number 6, the stare down between Shindo and Godzilla from Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. And when it came to choosing a moment from this movie, I actually had 3 other contenders, with the first one being the appearance of Mecha King Ghidorah, followed by Godzilla during his battle with King Ghidorah earlier in the movie, blowing off one of his heads, to even the point in time where we actually have our main cast of characters traveling back in time and seeing the US Navy battling a pre-mutated Godzilla. But after rewatching the movie again earlier this year, I decided to stick with the moment where Shindo and Godzilla reunite at the end of the movie before Godzilla's climactic battle with Mecha King Ghidorah. And not only do I think this is the most iconic moment from Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, but I also think it's one of the most iconic moments from the entire Godzilla franchise as a whole. Because that scene, for years, has garnered many debates between critics and fans alike. Because it's just one of those scenes where people could just look at it and interpret it in many different ways. But if I had to put in my own 2 cents on the whole matter, let's really look at this scene, starting with Shindo himself, because back in World War II, he was an honorable soldier who was serving the Japanese Empire during World War II. Now remember, the Japanese during World War II kind of had their own agenda, in which they tried to fulfill their own manifest destiny by expanding the Japanese Empire across every continent. That way, the world, in some shape or form, served under the Japanese Empire, which never happened. Now, moving forward to Shindo in the year 1992, he's now kind of a crooked businessman. I mean, the guy owns an illegal nuclear submarine. So when we do see his eventual reunion with Godzilla, I think Shindo in the year 1992 is meant to represent Japan around that time period, because outside of the movie, the Japanese tried to teach their own history to a younger generation, in which they never mentioned any of the war crimes they committed during World War II. So I think having Godzilla representing Japan in that context, and having him show up literally in front of Shindo, is meant to symbolize how Japan should not have forgotten the horrific stuff they did during World War II, in that the past is coming back to haunt everybody. Hence why I think Shindo in that scene nodded to Godzilla to give him permission to kill him, so that people can remember the horrific things the Japanese did in World War II. At least that's one way of looking at it. Not only that, but there is contrast between Shindo and Godzilla within that scene, where you have Shindo, who is a figurative titan that became this businessman that helped form Japan's social economic state within the context of this movie, is now being confronted by Godzilla, who is a literal titan that's going around destroying everything he built. And again, much like my entry for number 8, this also is a good example of visual storytelling. And not only that, but the stare down between Shindo and Godzilla, there's a lot being said without actually having anything being said. Coming in at number 5, an alliance is formed, the Showa edition, from Ghidorah, the 3-headed monster. And I know this scene is very infamous among Godzilla fans due to the corny nature of having Godzilla, Mothra, and Rodan talking to each other about fighting Ghidorah, but I do think it is a very important scene, not just within the context of the movie, but within the context of the entire franchise. Since Ghidorah the 3-headed monster was the overall 3rd big crossover movie within the Showa series, with the first 2 being King Kong vs. Godzilla, followed by Mothra vs. Godzilla. This one being significant because not only is this the 2nd time Godzilla and Mothra appeared in a movie together, but this was also the first time the character of Rodan has appeared in a Godzilla movie, since Rodan had only appeared in one other movie prior to this, that being Rodan. Another reason why I think this scene is really iconic to the Godzilla franchise. As the YouTuber The Omnivore put it in one of his videos, this was the scene that really brought forth the idea that the giant monsters themselves are not mindless killing machines. They are full-fledged characters, and this was the moment where we saw each of the monsters' personalities being brought forth. Because prior to this, in each of their own solo movies, yes, the monsters were creatures that relied on natural instinct, but they did have a sense of character to them. It was just subtle. Whereas this scene, on the other hand, it took what subtleties each of those characters had and brought to the forefront, giving each and every single monster an established personality. Unlike the majority of giant monsters that appeared in a lot of American-produced movies from the 1950s to early 60s where they were just mindless killing machines that had no sense of character to them, with a few exceptions here and there like Talos from Jason and the Argonauts, but I'm getting off topic here. Another reason why I think this scene is really important is what it represents. Because the idea behind this scene is that it's meant to represent world unity. Because you have to remember, Godzilla himself was meant to be a metaphor for the usage of nuclear weapons from an American point of view, whereas Rodan was also meant to represent the usage of nuclear weapons from the Russian point of view. Therefore, when you had Godzilla battling Rodan prior to the monsters conversing with each other, it was quite literally meant to represent the Cold War that was going on at the time, with Mothra representing another superpower, trying to convince the other two that, yes, by yourselves you're strong, but together we can be stronger and accomplish great things. In this case, joining forces to fight and defeat King Ghidorah, which I could best describe as being something similar to how gods from any mythology would converse with one another, no matter if it's the Olympians from Greek mythology or the various different groups of gods from Norse mythology, discussing whether or not the humans should be saved. And the final reason as to why I consider this to be one of the most iconic moments of the Godzilla franchise is that this was the turning point of not only the original Showa era of the Godzilla franchise, but for the franchise in general. Because not only did this affect the tone of the movies moving forward, but this also really affected how Godzilla would be depicted as well. Because prior to this movie, Godzilla had predominantly been playing the role of the villain. But from this movie, this was the turning point where Godzilla started to become the hero. Sure, within the context of this movie, he fell under the category of being more of an anti-hero, but moving forward, he would become the defender of Earth, which is why I consider this to be one of the most iconic moments of the franchise. Coming in at number 4. A father's loving embrace from Son of Godzilla. This moment hails from a movie that's often divisive among Godzilla fans, but why I consider this moment right here to be very iconic to the franchise. It all has to do with the characterization of Godzilla in this particular movie, because to most casual moviegoers who aren't Godzilla fans, they don't really see Godzilla himself as a character. They just see him as a big, mindless monster that has no sense of personality, even though within the context of the franchise, no matter if Godzilla's playing the role of the hero or a villain or everything else in between, he always has displayed a sense of character. This movie being no different, but we get to see Godzilla in a different kind of role, that of a father figure. And why I think the final moments of this movie are very important to both him as a character and the franchise as a whole. Because at the start of the movie, when Godzilla first met his son, he was very much a reluctant father figure who, for better or for worse, didn't really want anything to do with his kid. Or if he did, he was being very abusive about it. But after he and Minya both defeat Kumonga, and you had the humans activating the weather experiment that freezes the island, we get this moment where Minya, while trying to follow in his father's literal footsteps, collapses and starts to struggle because of how cold it's getting. Godzilla at that moment turns around, walks back to his son, picks him up, and starts to hug him as snow continues to fall around them, leading them into hibernation. And at that exact moment, Godzilla went from being this reluctant, somewhat abusive father figure to now becoming a loving father to a son, displaying a very different side of Godzilla we have never seen before. And to add on top of that, this is also a great example of visual storytelling in that sense, where there is not a single line of dialogue uttered by any character or narration that tells you what's going on. You understand what's going on through the visuals alone. And for a scene that conceptually consists of 2 actors wearing quote-unquote rubber lizard costumes, the entire scene is also really heartwarming to watch. Because not only do we see Godzilla embracing his role as a father figure to his son, but within the context of the Showa timeline, we see two monsters who could potentially be the last of their kind embracing each other out of love, ending the movie on a more optimistic note. Number 3. Godzilla's death from Godzilla vs. Destroyer. This scene is probably a no-brainer being this high on the list, because even though this wouldn't be the first nor last time we see Godzilla die on screen, Godzilla's death in this movie hits differently. Because even though the entire movie was basically advertised as being the Godzilla movie to kill off Godzilla, which at the time of its release was a really big deal, we all saw it coming, but when his death does occur, it really does hit hard for this one reason. Unlike all the other times in which we see Godzilla die on screen, this particular Godzilla death was for a Godzilla that we, the audience, have gotten to know over the course of several movies. Because when you really look at Godzilla's entire story arc within the context of the Heisei series, starting with 1984's The Return of Godzilla up to Godzilla vs. Destroyer, this is how you can break down Godzilla's entire story arc from start to finish. In The Return of Godzilla, we meet a Godzilla who's pissed off at the world, but he's also by himself and essentially wants to seek out other members of his kind, if any exist, as hinted by the fact that we see him follow a flock of seagulls. Then, in Godzilla vs. Biollante, you get the introduction of Biollante, who's this abomination in nature created from the cells of Godzilla, and thus you have a moment where Godzilla approaches Biollante thinking she's another member of his species and doesn't really intend to fight. However, because Biollante gets scared of him, they ended up fighting each other anyways. And between Godzilla vs. Biollante up to Godzilla and Mothra the Battle for Earth, Godzilla has maintained his persona of being just angry at the world because he's trying to seek out another member of his kind. You fast forward to Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 with the introduction of Baby Godzilla. We now see him find another member of his species, and we get to see him start to develop into a different kind of character where, yes, he is still angry, but he's angry not because he's been provoked by mankind or by himself. He's angry because he just simply wants to connect with his son, who's scared of him and leaves for a bit out of sadness. And by the time the movie ends with the defeat of Mechagodzilla, we finally get a moment where Godzilla has finally found another member of his species, more importantly, a member that he can call his son, and decides to mellow out and raise Baby as his own. Then, of course, in Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, we clearly do see that Godzilla cares for his son to a point where he tries to protect him from Space Godzilla, and the moment Baby gets captured by Space Godzilla, Godzilla is now angry at Space Godzilla for attacking and trapping his son. Again, we have a Godzilla who's angry and provoked, not because he's by himself, because he just wants to protect a member of his family. Then you get the events of Godzilla vs. Destroyer, where for a good chunk of the movie, a lot of the characters are under the impression that Baby has died due to the island in which he and Godzilla were on being atomized, only to discover that Baby is in fact alive and well, now taking on the form of a adolescent adult in the form of Godzilla Jr. And after we see both Godzilla and Godzilla Jr. reunite, their reunion is cut short by a Destroyer who kills Godzilla Jr., resulting in a fight between Godzilla and Destroyer. And at this point, Godzilla, on top of approaching death's door, he is now at his most angriest because he finally reunites with a member of his family, only for that family member to die in front of him, and he's now got nothing to lose. And after fighting Destroyer for a little bit and temporarily defeating him, he tries to revive his son, which fails, and before he could even have a chance to mourn over his son's death, Destroyer returns once more to even further inflict physical and emotional pain on Godzilla, which leads to one final confrontation with Destroyer, resulting in Destroyer's demise, which now leads into Godzilla's death scene. And the way this scene plays out, during the entire sequence, I believe only one or two lines of dialogue are spoken throughout the entire scene, but other than that, this entire sequence is told with visual storytelling, where you don't need to have all these characters explain what happened. The visual is doing exactly that. In addition to the visual storytelling, you also have this really somber music playing in the background as Godzilla is not only being frozen, but also melting to his death. And what makes his death extra tragic at that exact moment is the roar he lets out. It's not so much a roar of victory over the demise of Destroyer, it's a roar of sadness, as Godzilla doesn't so much go out with a bang, but goes out with a whimper, as we finally hear him moaning over the death of his son, as he begins to melt into a radioactive pile of goop. Even the human characters within the context of the movie stand silent as he dies. Because you have to remember, throughout the entire Heisei series, mankind has tried actively to find a way to get rid of or kill Godzilla. Yet when he finally dies, nobody cheers. There's no celebration, nobody says a word. They all just stand there in silence, feeling pity and sorrow for this creature. For all intents and purposes, was nothing more than a victim of man's hubris. And of course, this death scene hits very differently now, given that the suit actor who played Godzilla during the Heisei series did pass away, so rest in peace, Kenpachiro Satsuma. Coming in at number 2, Godzilla's Rampage from the original 1954 classic. And I'm not gonna lie, trying to pick one moment from this movie was not easy, because there are so many to choose from. Everything from the moment we first see Godzilla towering over the hill, terrorizing the main cast of characters, to even Aizawa sacrificing himself to not only kill Godzilla, but also to rid the world of the oxygen destroyer in the process. But I ultimately went with his final rampage during the last third of the movie for a few reasons. Reason number 1, this rampage set the bar for giant monster rampages seen not just within the entire Godzilla franchise, but within the entire giant monster genre as a whole. Without it, we wouldn't be where we're at today with a lot of these movies featuring monsters going on a rampage. Reason number 2, at some point during Godzilla's rampage, we cut away to this mother holding her 2 children, telling them, "Don't worry, we'll be with your father soon enough." And the first time I ever saw that scene, my mind was blown, because prior to watching the Japanese version of the movie, I had only ever seen the Americanized Godzilla King of the Monsters version with Raymond Burr. And when watching the original Japanese cut and having that moment come up, it shocked me, because I was not expecting the movie to be that dark. And not only that, but for a moment that lasts maybe 13 seconds, you understand everything about that family's situation in regards to what they're going through, and also showcasing just how dark the Godzilla franchise can be when it's not being a live-action Saturday morning cartoon, and showcasing why the human element matters in a giant monster movie. And before I go to what I consider to be the most iconic moment of the entire franchise, here are some honorable mentions. A happy moment from the invasion of Astro Monster, aka Godzilla vs. Monster Zero. Godzilla's drop kick from Godzilla vs. Megalon. King Ghidorah vs. the Earth Monsters from Destroy All Monsters. The atomic breath scene from Godzilla -1. The Kiss of Death from Godzilla 2014. Godzilla Earth Awakens from Godzilla Planet of the Monsters. Mass Awakening from Godzilla King of the Monsters. Godzilla flying after Hedorah from Godzilla vs. Hedorah. And finally, Kiryu's Rampage from Godzilla against Mechagodzilla. And coming in at number 1 is the battle at Mount Fuji from King Kong vs. Godzilla. And why I consider this to be the single most iconic moment of the entire Godzilla franchise, for the following reasons. Reason number 1, this is the first time we have cinema's 2 most iconic movie monsters fighting each other. And you have to keep in mind, unlike today's cinematic landscape where movie crossovers are very commonplace, back in the day, crossovers like this were very much a novelty that didn't happen often. And when they did, it was a really big deal. This movie being no exception, to such a point that Toho themselves have for decades tried to either make a follow-up or a remake of this particular movie. And King Kong and Godzilla wouldn't fight each other until 2021's Godzilla vs. Kong. Reason number two, the dynamic between King Kong and Godzilla is very similar to that of a father-son relationship in a meta kind of sense, considering that King Kong was one of two inspirations, if not the main inspiration behind the creation of Godzilla. And without King Kong, you wouldn't have Godzilla. So it is really cool to see two monsters that are connected to each other through that context in terms of how one inspired the other. Which leads into my third point. This battle between King Kong and Godzilla is perhaps the single most important moment in this entire franchise. Because you have to remember, before this movie was even made between 1933 up to the late 1950s, King Kong was the more popular monster because King Kong was known the world over because of how the original 1933 classic changed the landscape of cinema. People barely knew who Godzilla was, unless if you were the Japanese or the Americans who saw the Americanized cut of Godzilla King of the Monsters featuring Raymond Burr. So then lead to the creation of this movie, and this right here is literally the moment that shook the earth, because this one moment, this one movie, is what introduced the entire world to Godzilla, and without it, we wouldn't have 70 years worth of Godzilla content to talk about, which is why I consider the Mount Fuji battle between King Kong and Godzilla to be the single most iconic moment within the Godzilla franchise. And there you have it. Those are what I consider to be the most iconic moments of the entire Godzilla franchise. What are some moments that you consider to be the most iconic? Here's to 70 years of Godzilla, and see you later.